Sometimes fate offered not a continuation, but only a pause, a brief station along the journey where warmth appeared like a fragile flame in the wind. It never promised permanence, never suggested the certainty of tomorrow. Instead, it arrived in quiet hours, reminding a weary heart that it still carried the ability to feel, to be stirred, to open even after years of silence. Love did not always exist to build houses or families or the long weaving of shared days. At times it came for a single night, for a fleeting season, a delicate moment etched deeper than the longest companionship. What endured was not the body beside another in bed for decades, but the unlooked-for memory of touch, the sound of rain against a window, the faint scent of someone's coat lingering in the air. That was a secret no one admitted aloud. The smallest interludes often outlasted the grandest vows. Hearts measured not in permanence, but in the intensity of recognition, in the sudden awareness of being seen. Even when the years moved on and the roads parted, the glimmer of that brief encounter remained like an ember hidden under ashes, soft but unextinguished, enough to light the darkness again whenever solitude grew heavy. In April of 1989, Jonathan arrived in Portland, Oregon, carrying a single suitcase and the faintest outline of hope. He was 40 years old, his profession once celebrated, but his life recently fractured by a divorce that had left behind a silence heavier than any building he had ever designed. The train that brought him north had cut through landscapes that blurred into one another, rain-slicked fields, dark stretches of pine, towns where windows glowed faintly before vanishing again into night. When he stepped onto the platform, the city greeted him not with fanfare, but with the quiet persistence of damp air that clung to skin and fabric alike. The scent of the Willamette River mingled with the sharper fragrance of cedar and fir, a mixture both cleansing and oppressive. The sky hung low, pale and heavy, as though it had pressed itself closer to earth. He walked streets that seemed endlessly washed by rain, the pavement shimmering as if it had absorbed the reflections of street lamps and passing cars. Storefronts stood muted, their glass panes veiled with condensation, and each corner carried the faint hum of neon that flickered like uncertain promises. Portland in spring was not a city of bright welcomes, but of subdued endurance, a place where the weather etched itself into every surface and forced its inhabitants to adapt to its constancy. Jonathan felt the rhythm of it settling into his bones as he carried his suitcase up the incline toward the neighborhood that would soon be his refuge. His apartment waited in an aging house built in 1910, a structure leaning gently toward the street as if bowing beneath the years. Its wooden siding was chipped and weary, paint curling back to reveal older layers that hinted at forgotten colors. The staircase at the entrance groaned beneath his weight, each board carrying the sound upward into the shadowed hallway. Rust had bitten into the mailbox, and the railing left faint flakes of white on his hand when he steadied himself. When he unlocked the door, it resisted as though unused for too long, then yielded with a reluctant sigh. Inside, the rooms were bare and carried the smell of dust and faint mildew, an aroma of long neglect mixed with the sharpness of old wood. Light from the gray afternoon filtered through narrow windows, falling across cracked linoleum and worn floorboards. The silence was immediate and profound, pressing against his ears until he could hear only his own breath. Yet in that silence there was no judgment. The walls did not ask why he had come, nor did they echo the failures he carried. Instead, they seemed to extend a kind of fragile mercy, a permission to exist without explanation. Jonathan stood there for several moments, suitcase at his feet, letting the stillness envelop him. For the first time in years, he felt that perhaps solitude itself could be a form of shelter, as never about what could be kept. It was about what could never be forgotten. On the third evening, as the drizzle of early spring traced thin silver lines along the edges of the street, Jonathan returned to the old house that now served as his fragile beginning. The air was damp, heavy with the scent of wet earth and pine needles, and the faint glow of street lamps trembled against the slick pavement. He reached the front steps and saw, beneath the dim light that buzzed about the entryway, a woman standing at the stubborn door. Her shoulders were squared against the effort of balancing a heavy paper sack filled with groceries, while coaxing a reluctant lock that refused to yield. The bag sagged dangerously in her arms, edges darkened by moisture, the weight of bottles and fruit pressing against the paper. Strands of hair, streaked faintly with silver, had loosened from the knot at the back of her head and clung damply to her face. The coat she wore was simple, utilitarian, but it did not diminish the quiet authority with which she moved. Her presence filled the narrow porch as though it belonged to her long before Jonathan's arrival, each gesture steady and unhurried despite the inconvenience. He paused a step away, watching as the metal scraped and caught, the echo of it traveling up the stairwell. The faint thud of the grocery sack as she shifted it to her hip carried the sound of frustration unspoken, the rhythm of someone too accustomed to small battles with stubborn things. Her expression was not one of helplessness but of weary determination, the look of a person who had performed this ritual countless times before. Jonathan extended his hand with the key he held, and she accepted it without hesitation, without ceremony, as though it were a tool being passed in silence between workers. With a swift and practiced motion she turned it in the lock, and the door relented with a muted click, surrendering as if it recognized her persistence. She pushed it open easily, her movements efficient, confident, unadorned by any need for acknowledgment. For a moment she looked at him, her eyes steady and clear, carrying a weight that made words unnecessary. Her glance lingered just long enough to leave the impression of strength held quietly beneath the surface. Then she shifted her groceries back into her arms and stepped inside. The faint sound of her footsteps on the wooden stairs rose into the still air, marking the space she claimed in the house without proclamation. Jonathan remained where he was, his key still warm in his hand, struck not by the brief exchange itself, but by the unmistakable gravity of her presence. The locket yielded, but it was she who seemed immovable, carrying with her a permanence that contrasted the transience he himself embodied. It was in that moment, beneath the dripping eaves and the trembling light of the porch lamp, that he first felt the quiet force of the woman who lived above him. From that day forward, Jonathan began to notice her everywhere, as though her presence had always been woven into the fabric of the house, and he had only just learned to see it. Each morning, before the sun had fully risen, her footsteps moved down the wooden staircase with a clarity that set the tone for the day. They were not hurried, nor hesitant, but steady and deliberate, the measured rhythm of someone who carried certainty into every hour. The old boards creaked under her weight, and the sound lingered in the hallway even after she had gone, leaving behind a sense that the house itself had awakened in her passing. In the evenings, when the narrow basement laundry room filled with the low hum of machines, he would often find her seated on the worn bench beneath the harsh fluorescent light. A book rested open in her lap, the pages touched by her fingers with an ease that spoke of long familiarity. She wore a simple sweater, its fabric softened with age, and she seemed untouched by the unkind brightness of the bulb that flattened every shadow. The machines rumbled around her, yet she read without distraction, as if the noise itself surrendered to her stillness. Once a week she appeared at the front steps, where a modest row of pots stood exposed to the shifting weather. The plants within them, sprigs of rosemary, mint, and a struggling fern, were fragile survivors of the lingering cold. She bent to them with quiet care, pouring water slowly, brushing away dead leaves, adjusting their position so they might catch the pale reach of daylight. The gestures were unremarkable, almost invisible, yet Jonathan saw in them a deliberate resistance against neglect, as if she believed that persistence alone could coax life to remain in this damp city. Through these small rituals the house itself seemed steadier, its weary beams and weathered siding somehow fortified by her quiet authority. The rain that endlessly drummed against the windows no longer sounded quite so bleak when accompanied by the memory of her footsteps. The silence of the stairwell felt less hollow, as though it had been claimed by her presence. Even the shadows in the hall appeared softened, infused with the faint impression of a life carried with resolve. Jonathan realized that she was not merely a neighbor, but a force that shaped the rhythm of his days, a steady current beneath the surface of his solitude, unspoken yet undeniable dot on one of the wettest nights of that restless spring. The radiator in Jonathan's apartment gave its final groan and fell silent, leaving the rooms to grow colder with every passing hour. He sat wrapped in a blanket, the air damp enough to seep through the fabric, when a soft and deliberate knock echoed against his door. When he opened it, Evelyn stood framed in the dim hallway, a toolbox balanced in her hands as if it were simply an extension of herself. The corridor light caught the strands of silver in her hair, and for a moment the sight of her felt like an answer to a question he had not dared to ask. She entered without hesitation, setting the metal box down beside the radiator, and knelt with the ease of someone who had solved problems like this many times before. Her movements were efficient and unhurried, each turn of the screwdriver measured, her presence commanding the silence of the room. Jonathan stepped back, watching the quiet concentration etched into her face before retreating into the small kitchen where he placed water to boil. The whistle of the kettle rose above the faint scrape of tools, blending with the sound of rain pressing insistently against the windows. When the radiator yielded nothing to her effort, she sat back on her heels, wiping a trace of dust from her hands. Jonathan poured 2 cups of tea, the steam rising in delicate curls that softened the edges of the chill air. They settled on the worn floorboards, the candle he had lit casting a trembling circle of light between them. The flame bent each time the wind slipped through the cracks in the frame, and shadows danced across the walls as though the house itself breathed along with them. Outside, the storm grew fiercer, the rain drumming against the glass in relentless rhythm. Evelyn's voice, low and even, began to fill the space with fragments of memory. Winters in Idaho, where the cold arrived with a sharpness that pierced but never clung, a cold that was honest in its severity, unlike the damp weight of Portland's rain that crept slowly into the mind. Jonathan listened, drawn not to the stories themselves, but to the cadence of her words, the steadiness that seemed to anchor the restless night. As the hours lengthened, silence stretched between them, but it was no longer empty. It carried the warmth of shared space, of unspoken recognition. When she allowed her head to rest gently against his shoulder, the gesture felt neither sudden nor uncertain. It was a quiet acceptance, a moment when 2 weary lives leaned into each other without demand. Their first kiss unfolded not with urgency but with reverence, a simple acknowledgment that loneliness had found its brief reprieve. The night lingered, slow and fragile, as though time itself conspired to preserve the rare and tender warmth that had settled between them. A few days later, Jonathan returned to find a folded sheet of paper slipped neatly into the narrow space of his doorframe. The handwriting was precise, each letter evenly measured, the sort of script that spoke of restraint rather than impulse. The message was brief, yet it carried the weight of finality. Robert had returned, and time was needed. He stood for a long while with the note in his hand. The hallway hushed around him, the faint draft from the stairwell lifting the edges of the page as though the words themselves resisted being still. Robert was not an unfamiliar stranger, but the man who had shared Evelyn's life for many years, the partner who knew the smallest contours of her routines, the way she set down her keys, the coffee she chose in the mornings, the quiet patterns that filled her silences. With him her life had been defined by familiarity, the kind of structure that left little room for uncertainty. That recognition, though muted, offered her a sense of security, an assurance that tomorrow would arrive clothed in the same fabric as yesterday. When she finally spoke to Jonathan about it, her voice carried no hesitation. She explained that with Robert, life had been carved into predictable shapes, and even if love itself had faded, the comfort of knowing what could be expected held its own gravity. With Jonathan, there was no such certainty. Instead, there was the unsettling tremor of feeling alive again, the pulse of something uncharted, fragile, and dangerous. It was not that she rejected it. Rather, she feared the weight of rediscovering a life that could unravel as quickly as it had appeared. Jonathan listened in silence, his hands folded loosely in his lap. He did not attempt to argue, nor did he try to persuade her with promises that would ring hollow in the face of her resolve. He understood, perhaps more than she realized, that to plead for her choice would diminish the brief truth they had shared. The quiet between them thickened, but it was not anger that filled it. It was acceptance, the recognition that love arriving late in life did not always have the strength to triumph over the call of habit. He watched her lower her gaze as if carrying a trace of shame for admitting that she leaned toward the known instead of the unknown. In that moment, Jonathan felt the stillness of surrender, not in defeat, but in acknowledgement. Some connections, however rare, were never meant to outlast the season that bore them. He let the silence stand as his answer, offering her the freedom to walk back into the life she had chosen, even as it left him with the undeniable awareness that what they had touched was fleeting yet indelible dot. A week later, Jonathan stepped into a small bookstore on Broadway, one of those narrow places where the scent of paper lingered thickly in the air and the floors creaked with each movement. The shelves stood close together, crowded with volumes whose spines bore the weight of time, and the dim light from the high windows carried a muted glow that softened the edges of the room. He had entered without purpose, driven only by the familiar comfort of aisles filled with stories that were not his own. It was there, near a table stacked with newly arrived titles, that he saw her. Evelyn stood in a pale coat, her hair loosely tied at the back, the silver strands catching the faintest trace of light. Beside her was a man in a gray overcoat, whose presence carried the ease of long belonging. His hand rested around hers with the assurance of habit, fingers entwined not as a declaration, but as a continuation of something deeply known. Together they moved slowly through the aisle, the rhythm of their steps matched by years of shared cadence. Evelyn noticed him before he had the chance to turn away. Their eyes met across the narrow space, and for a breath the sounds of the store fell into silence. There was no sharpness in her gaze, no regret carved deep enough to wound. What lingered instead was a quiet gratitude, tempered with a faint shadow of sorrow that seemed to acknowledge what had been given and what could not be kept. She inclined her head slightly, a gesture that held both farewell and remembrance, and in that brief acknowledgment the distance between them was both bridged and confirmed. Jonathan returned the gesture with equal restraint, a small nod that carried the weight of acceptance. No words were spoken, for words would have only unraveled the fragile dignity of the moment. He left the bookstore without looking back, the rain greeting him as he stepped onto the street. The city was blurred by the steady downpour, light stretching into long streaks across wet pavement, and the air was heavy with the scent of earth and stone. The sound of his footsteps dissolved into the rhythm of the storm, and for the first time he felt that solitude was no longer a burden but a companion. That evening, in the quiet of his apartment, Jonathan opened a new notebook. The pages welcomed him with their emptiness, and the sentences came easily, flowing like water set free. He did not write of loss, nor of endings, but of the presence of a woman who had once entered with a box of tools and left behind a warmth that endured beyond her absence. In the act of writing, he understood that what remained was not the ache of departure, but the gift of having been seen, and that gift would be enough to carry him through the long seasons ahead.